Welcome back, peeps, to Purrfect.dev, where we give you cats the freshest dose of dev snacks.
Now with your amazing hosts, Alex Patterson and Brittany Postma. This episode brought to you by Storyblok. Build anything and publish everywhere.
Welcome back, Purrfect Peeps, to another Purrfect.dev. Today we have with us Greg Whitworth from Salesforce to talk about OpenUI. And if you've ever created a select dropdown or tooltip or tried to style pretty much any kind of custom component, you will know the pain that OpenUI is trying to solve. So we're going to get started and talk about that today. Greg, do you want to give us a little background and intro into how you got into this?
Sure, yeah. So I've been at Salesforce for now about two years. I work on like the UI framework platform team here. So LWC is a framework that we use here. It's comparable to like you think Svelte or Vue or something along those lines. Prior to this, I worked on Edge HTML over on Microsoft Edge, and spent a ton of time there working with folks across different browser vendors and stuff of that nature. I don't know how much you want me to get into like how OpenUI got started, but like spent a ton of time in standard CSS Grid, CSS Working Group, Flex, all those wonderful interop stories through the years. And finally the transition over to Chromium. The last 2 years I was there, which was nice, which allowed actually to be able to spend some time thinking about projects such as OpenUI.
Oh, nice. Do you work on the design system at Salesforce? Don't they have
No.
one?
Yeah, okay, they do.
Yeah.
So the Lightning design system, that's another team. I work closely with them, but yeah, I don't work on it directly.
I gotcha.
You kind of brought up an interesting part with the LWC piece. For those who don't know and haven't checked it out, that is pure web components, correct?
Yeah, so we have a few polyfills. So but it is built on top of on web components, just because of the fact that like ultimately at the end of the day, we know that the web platform will kind of be forever, but frameworks kind of change all over the place. And so we took made a heavy bet on web components years ago, and wrote a lot of polyfills because Salesforce's enterprise software, so we have support I11 and all that other stuff. So we have a ton of polyfills. But I'm super actually stoked. Yesterday, we actually just announced that we're going to be ending support for them, I11. So I'm super stoked about that. Yeah. But so, and also we've done a lot of work because of that. Like we've also started, Salesforce has been working with the Gallia landing features into native web components so that we can remove even more things that like Salesforce specific. We are working with them on fixing some like the ARIA reflection issues, with native Shadow DOM accessibility issues and stuff, as well as Shadow Realms actually just landed. So that's something that we have for like Locker, for example, at Salesforce for security reasons for cross namespace component traversal. So all kinds of cool things that are happening in that space. But yeah, this is the design system, the components that you can use at Salesforce.
So this is completely open source as well, or no?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
You can go. This is just the catalog, so people can kind of see them and go use them, because we have the builders and stuff when you're building apps on Salesforce itself.
Gotcha. It's funny because I huge fan of web components forever, and like Stencil was the thing, and then like Lit Element was the thing, and we finally decided web components aren't the next thing, and I'm like, who made this decision? And I'm like, I thought everyone was going that way, right?
Yeah, I'm interested to hear Greg's opinion on web components, which, I mean, you went all in on them, but why do more people not use them? I have an opinion, but I want to hear your opinion.
I want to know.
I actually feel like they especially with React stepping forward and supporting custom elements, I actually feel like that's a huge win. I feel like they will be cemented. I think one of the things that's kind of a misnomer is, if you're going to look on Twitter, for example, there's a lot of people that get kind of in arguments between web components and frameworks. And it's right now what web components can solve is pretty much the leaf nodes. That's what they can solve. That's just reality. So it's you can build a bunch of leaf nodes and they become very portable. You can go anywhere where a web browser that supports native web components can render. And that makes it super powerful. So but can you build a full application just with native web components? No, because you have to manage all the state and stuff yourself and all those other things. So you're still going to reach for some framework And then even in that, there's still a lot of like DX things that web components, native web components don't bring to the table that, like, for example, like LWC, that's some of the things that we do is we like are like, you know what, you don't have to author native web components this way. And it's things that I've talked to a lot of the standards folks about, like, why don't we just have declarative custom elements by default, where it just boilerplates the meaningful defaults of a native, rather than having to go, let me go register it. It's like, you guys have the lists, the second you see a dash, look at the tokenized name and say, is it in the registry? If it's not, put it in the global one. You know what I mean? And it's like, set up the bootstrap. If I want to reach for JS to go set my own, like tweak the defaults, then sure. But there's just some of those like DX things that don't exist. So I think people will continue to reach for frameworks probably forever, to be honest with you.
Yeah, that's exactly my opinion too, is that the DX of web components is not as nice as some of the frameworks make it.
Hard.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So kind of steering back, total side, like,
yeah.
because
it's great.
Always like get me interested, and like I've done Angular elements and like all kinds of things, and I was like huge on it, and then like that DX piece like just crushes my soul every time. So it's a really good discussion. So
I think it's worth just sorry to just like piggyback just one last thing. Like, so is almost all of them now, you can go look Vue, Svelte, all of them, you can transpile down to native web components. And so it's one of those things where it's like, I think more and more are going to start using that as the like transport layer for interop. It's like, sure, choose your framework for DX, and we'll continue to fill the gaps. And I would point people to the web components community group that are trying to even bridge that interop layer for protocols. So anyways, I'll shut up to your point.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's great stuff. Like, I'll dig into that further, for sure. So kind of steering back to our original thoughts around the design system for web, there's this whole piece that you're working on called OpenUI. Can you just break down a very high level, and then we'll do an ad and come back, but high level, what is OpenUI all about?
So hopefully nobody ever has to build their own custom components or controls again, to be completely honest with you. Like, I think I think Brittany, you asked at the very beginning, whoever's built their own select control. That pretty much is the crux of it. Is usually when we went out and we did a bunch of surveys my last couple of years at Microsoft, and we're just kind of our leadership asked the right question, which is, hey, we're spending all these time revamping all the Chromium controls and components to match what we had, because we had a very high bar, in our opinion, for our controls in Edge HTML. And they were like, we never see our controls and components when we're browsing the web normally, like all of these, especially the really complex ones. Like, sure, we see our input there and button and so on. So why are we spending this much time building them? And it actually was highlighting the problem, not necessarily like we shouldn't invest in this. It was actually like, well, everybody goes and rebuilds them. And then when you dig into why do they go rebuild them, a lot of them, it's actually just because they want to change colors. Like, it may be as simple as that. But then, of course, there's this broad spectrum of, oh, well, I wanted to add in, an extra item here. Like, so if you think of like the video element, for example, you have an attribute of controls or no controls. It's like, it's all or nothing. Yeah. And it's like, so many of them, it's like, well, I just wanted to add another, icon down in the menu bar down at the bottom. And it's one of those things where it's like, okay, so now I have to completely rebuild an entire video editor, or go grab a third-party one, right? That's probably what most people are going to do. They're going to go grab a third-party one. But it's like, the fact that you have to do that when it was probably a very minor adjustment, a good example of one that we had on Chromium was, hey, like, I'm going to completely build it because of the fact that like your window by default has a drop shadow, and I can't remove that drop shadow. And so it's one of those things where it's like, go rebuild the whole thing. So that's the point of OpenUI, is trying to standardize those controls and components so that they are stylable and extensible across that spectrum.
Yeah, and I have something I want to touch on that after the break, but Tony had a question before we do that. Is Salesforce backing OpenUI at all?
It depends on what you mean by backing. I invest my time, so yes, in the fact that Salesforce is backing that in that way, yes. Also, a lot of I share every time that we get like new primitives and stuff come out. I share it out with the SLDS folks. They provide feedback. Like, there's primitives coming out, for example, the popup, as well as like anchor position for CSS. all these things, like they're building these things every day as well. And they're like, sweet, I can delete like 400 lines of JavaScript and the browser can do it more performantly. Heck yes. So like they back it in the same way a lot of companies back standards, which is with their time.
Yes, time. And time is almost more valuable than money sometimes
Yes,
for these projects.
yes.
Yep. Yeah.
Cool. We'll jump out to our sponsor and then we'll come back with some more. Thanks.
Sounds good.
We know that creating content can be a tedious balancing act. Developers want flexibility to make seamless digital experiences, while content teams need the tools to work independently. We make changes and are left to watch everything fall apart. We met our limits using plugin after plugin and waiting weeks for edits. All for this. We knew it was time to rebuild the blocks. Storyblok gives marketers creative control and use a visual editor to actually see what they're doing. And developers are no longer restrained to a set of technology. Storyblok has made it simple for each market with localization and personalization tools, and allows you to publish content on all channels and all devices. Truthfully, we all wanted the same thing: to deliver the right information to the right destination at the right time.
Thank you again, Storyblok, for throwing us some sponsorship money. That was really poorly put, but thanks, Storyblok.
Yeah, I wanted to touch a little bit on what Greg was mentioning before about like building your own select component. And I used to work for Granger building a design system, and we were building this select component and trying to put the arrow in a specific place and flip it and change the color of it. And doing that between all the browsers is the biggest pain. And so that browser compatibility piece is really what OpenUI is trying to solve? How are we working with multiple browsers and getting it standardized across all of them?
Yeah. So again, going back to, so yes, that's the why we're there, is to like standardize those controls and components. And I'll be honest with you, it's kind of like a upward uphill battle to an extent, because there is a desire and we to try to not do that, because people are concerned that it locks, it restricts innovation for the future. And so like roughly, was it a year and a half ago now, myself and Melanie Richards, who was at Netlify but was at Microsoft at the time, we presented jointly to the CSS working group to kind of like, is this a problem that the W3C, the CSS working group, the browser vendors agree should be solved? Because of the fact that I know that argument, because I used to work on an engine that would use the native components, and that was, in all honesty, a lot of the reason that we would push back on that was like, we didn't want to rebuild the controls. We would just want to use the native ones. And so it's one of those things where like the way that we kind of shot that argument down in a lot of respects is we showed the very first Apple computer UI, we showed Windows 95, and it was one of those things that's like, has some of the layout change and maybe some of the interactions changed? Sure. But the model itself is the same. The like general UI is roughly the same as well. So it's not like there's been like 30 years of drastic select innovation where it's like, okay, well now you have a scroll wheel and they're larger on mobile, or hey, maybe on my watch it's like laid out in a circle. And but it's like the goal is still the same, the model is still the same. And so maybe your controller code needs to change, like basically again, that's where, but we have so much in CSS these days to be like where you generalize it down to pointers now rather than like clicks and hovers and this, that, and the other. And like with grid, it's like, okay, give us a different media query then if you come out with a new form factor. So I think the time is right to where we can say, yeah, let's actually standardize the anatomy, because we have to do that. We have to standardize the anatomy in order for, if we go back to the video scenario, in order for you to say, oh, I just want to add an additional control down at the end, well, that list has to be defined. Like we have to have that standardized and have the slots in the right place, leveraging web components to be able to say, oh yeah, you can reach in and you can change the DOM, but we need some way for all the browser vendors to say, no, by default, we want to innovate and have our own world. But then you can kind of opt into this standardized behavior where we'll all agree on a user agent style sheet, we'll all agree on controller code and anatomy, so that you can level set. And this kind of happens behind the scenes today, but it's not standardized. So like when you touch like a button, if you go change and you say, I'm going to go apply a 1 pixel border to just a button, all browsers actually reset a bunch of stuff to a default, their own default, but it's not standardized. So basically those are the things that we have to go standardize. It's like, what is that reset? And I'm not talking about CSS reset, mind you.
You're talking about the browser vendor resets.
And standardizing that. So it's like, so like imagine like we'll end up either having like an attribute or a CSS toggle of some form where it's kind of like, appearance, it's similar to appearance none, but it's also saying, hey, your markup has to be exactly the same, as well as all of your controller code is going to be the same. And by the way, it's going to be rendered in a way that web component functionality will work. So maybe by default, a browser vendor wants to actually use their native component, but once they see that, they have to revert into this like web tech space, so that you can use it. You can then at that point use it just like you would Bootstrap, or I don't know, pick your component library of choice.
I'm trying to figure, is it accent color? Is that the new one that got added? Okay. Yep.
So in kind of referencing that, like what we're trying to say is out of the box, standardized like buttons, and then kind of the hooks, the controllers that like come into those. This isn't trying to replace Bootstrap or replace Ant Design or anything like that. It's just trying to get consistency amongst all the browsers to make that easier to work with.
Well, and to use like Salesforce as a concrete example, like the select menu element that's in experimentation today, it's like once that gets to where it's like we've got, the accessibility discussions kind of ironed out, and we add in kind of like the combo box aspect, I would expect to then go to I'll approach like the SLDS folks and the base components team and be like, hey, why don't you guys, take this for a sprint and see if you could basically swap out your current select with the select menu. And everybody has more than enough work. So managing a select menu, like we would basically be able to delete all that code is my point. And so like the expectation wouldn't be that design systems go away or component libraries go away. It's just like most people actually don't write their own button these days. They actually just use the button, and it's like, how far along the spectrum can we keep moving that to where it's like, no, this solves 95% of the use cases to select with, or like, and then if we come out with a combo box, that was one of the key ones, was I want to be able to type and see it, filter, and all that other stuff. So it's like, if we land those, I think more and more people aren't going to have to be writing their own custom ones.
That's interesting. Yeah. So I'm just trying to think of like a future where every browser has agreed upon all of these things, at least like the base set of them.
Just having a standard.
Having that standard set. How impactful like is that, and why are we trying to accomplish that as a whole? Is it just so that we have more consistency and future proofing and not the mess that we used to be in? And I guess along that same line, is that kind of one of the reasons that Microsoft went with Chromium underneath instead of like trying to continue keeping up with all of this stuff?
So I'll take those as two questions.
Okay,
so the first one, as it relates to like, why are we doing this? It was one of those things where it's like, what ends up happening is people point to, oh, well, I don't know, pick any top, Fortune 500 company that you want, pick them out and say, they've got a team of devs focused and dedicated and working and building the best select menu on the planet, right?
Yeah.
It took maybe me and another PM when we first were investigating this of like, what is the ROI to the company and to the web platform as a whole, spending our time on this work. It took us maybe 30 minutes to find broken on Fortune 100 company sites, broken select or drop down type things from an accessibility perspective. So it was one of those things where you're kind of like, hey, and then you can kind of like, based on what you're looking at, hypothesize why they, didn't go with the native one. And it's one of those things where you just brought up accent color. It's like some of them truly, it was like a 1-to-1 with the native select, but they couldn't, change the padding of the pop-up window or something of that nature, something very basic. Mm-hmm. And so it's one of those things where it's like, it has a real negative impact on users. Like people, unfortunately, as much as people want to try, even the best of us, like accessibility is really hard. A lot of us don't have people that can go do user research studies against the designs we've done to ensure that they're fully accessible. And then on top of that, like we're kind of doing our best, that we can, but like by standardizing it and centrally bringing it together, like we have the ARIA working group, working with us on these. Likewise, hey, when these start landing, like we already are starting to have the discussions in OpenUI of like, okay, how do we get kind of like not necessarily a pool of money, but like who can actually go do the user research actually with this component, with users that actually are using like either Braille devices or your ATs that most people use, across that spectrum, of accessibility, not just the tab or navigation with keyboard, for example. And so it's one of those. That is the reason we're doing it. And then on top of that, like when you stop and think about it, we were talking about time and money. At the time when we investigated this, like in Microsoft, we kind of kicked it off. At the time, like if you think of all the different products Microsoft owns, they had 7 different component library teams that were building them out. So it's like, so I don't know, pick however many people you think are the size that need to exist for building a decent component library, and now multiply it by 7 and give them decent salaries and benefits. And then also think not again that they shouldn't have those jobs, but it's like, what would you rather them be spending their time on?
Yeah.
So
that's
it's very impactful actually for the industry as a whole.
It's like if everyone that used the web ever to do anything at an enterprise level gave you $1, maybe we have enough. I don't know.
Oh, it's just such a waste of time. These industries or these companies are putting the money and time into these developers to do this, and then having them create these components that aren't accessible. So that's the difficult part for me, is that then they're like customizing these things to fit the company, the designer standards, but they're not accessible for the users. Yeah.
Or not performant. Like there's any number, and that's to me that was one of the key things, was like, so if you take up the pop-up, which is one of the most recent things that we've started working on, the OpenUI, and Mason Fried and folks from Google have done a great job on the prototypes and planning that work. They can do things from a performance perspective we can't do. So like when you start thinking about anchor positioning, and if you think of like select, so here's the button, right? And then there's the pop-up. Well, based on how much real estate I have, where should we show that pop-up? Should we flip it or whatever? To do that in JavaScript, it's like you have to run that on the UI thread in order to get all the layout and positioning of things. Whereas like the browser already just went through layout, already knows where that is, can have that on a composite layer. So like all of a sudden they can do things for performance that like we can't do in the UI layer, not to mention that's additional JavaScript you're having to manage and so on. But it unlocks the potential for us to have these discussions of saying, no, we're actually going to lean in. We're going to not only solve this problem for improved accessibility, because that's amazing, but also for other things. And again, the time savings can't be diminished, and of course the monetary value to the companies of not investing in that time becomes valuable.
I should have mentioned a popover or tooltip, because that was literally the worst component I've ever tried to build with JavaScript. Is not fun.
Yeah, because you have to do all the, like, first get the layout of the contents inside, then check all of your surrounding real estate. Like, do you have other things over top of you, under you? And again, the browser already understands how to do windowing, which is effectively what we're talking about to an extent. And so it's like, let the browser just do it.
Let the browser do what it's good at. Yeah, I think that might be a good time to talk about what components are available. You mentioned the dialogue or the modal kind of component. Is that what you were just referencing?
Well, so pop-up it actually started out as a pop-up element. And there was a lot of discourse between what is the difference between a pop-up and a dialogue and all this other stuff. But what we ended up actually doing is pop-up is now going to be an attribute. It's actually not going to be a element in itself, because of the fact that you just brought up tooltips, for example. And so it's like, it's one of those things that a pop-up is not necessarily, it is effectively a generic container that happens to be rendered in the top layer. And so, but we kind of need to know that at the HTML time, not just the CSS time. So it's like, it's easy for people to think, oh, well, that's presentational, but it's like, actually, no, it has other implications for like ARIA has pop-up and all these other, like, you need to bind things together from a controller code perspective. So that is it's not a component that will be available, but we're actually getting very close to where we'll actually take, and this is actually in Chromium, you can go enable the experimental platform features, and you can actually go play with, hey, we have a button with a that anchors the button to a pop-up, and you add the pop-up attribute, and boom, now all of a sudden it's on top layer. It'll light dismiss. You can hit escape, it disappears. You click off of it, everything like you would expect works with it, which is different from a dialogue modal. We're super close to that actually getting graduated. We will actually take that to the WhatWG and land that in the HTML specification, at which point everybody will implement against that. But there's that one. Also the select menu. So like when we did the survey, select was by far and away the winner of like, here's the one that we've recreated. Here's the one that's the most frustrating. Here's the one that like, please work on first. So select menu is super close. The Microsoft Edge team has been primarily working on that. A ton of like engagement across OpenUI, browser vendors and stuff on that one. But they've been the primary drivers on that one, and they have a great blog post on Microsoft Edge Dev as well as CSS tricks showing. I mean, they've got like the full spectrum. Like they've got the, you can see them doing the GitHub label, combo box. And again, out of the box, the select menu doesn't support combo box, but because of the extensibility model that we built it on, you can do that, as well as they show like an emoji picture that's like, again, a circular, as well as like a color wheel. And again, this is all just starting with select menu. So it's one of those things where it's like select menu, likewise, enable experimental features, go check those out. But it kind of shows you the model that we'll be building everything else off on. And I would say that's kind of like, both of these are really complex. So somewhat slow makes sense, but it's also, we're kind of laying the foundation for what all the other ones will follow. And so it'll make it so all the other follow-on components will be able to relatively fast follow. They'll go much quicker, because we'll be like, okay, we do know the slotting mechanisms and the way in which we built select menu works. And, we'll have that rapport. So we'll be able to kind of start cranking out more and more. So like the range, slider, depending on which one you want to call it, range slider is another one that people want. Date pickers, color pickers, those ones. So
you actually just hit on something, because I feel like a lot of people watching this might not get kind of what we're trying to like explain out. And maybe this is a little self-promotion or whatever you want to call it, but I have a little like example for us to take a look at. So hopefully it'll like clarify. This is the Angular material framework library, whatever you want to call it. And here's their date picker. To load this and how much JavaScript and CSS there is, it's a crazy amount relatively to like none that the browser provides for you. I threw together this little code pen for Datetimelocal, and now that this is supported, you can just click this and like, what's wrong with that? Like, I think
look at how ugly it is. That's what's wrong with
you guys can't see that. That's interesting.
Oh no, we can't see it because
popped up off the thing.
Well, because it's in another window. Yeah. It's in another window, and
hang on.
But yes, but to your point, Brittany, like yes, they would want complete control over how that layout inside. Yeah.
I don't know why I can't.
And is that
well, because it's actually a separate. It's a true native window.
Here, let me just do this. It's gonna get real weird. I'm not gonna do that. I'm used to having more monitors.
That's okay. That's okay.
So just imagine that thing's kind of cool.
Does the window that you see look similar to the other window though, or does it look like your little input box there?
It looks a lot like. So you mean like this window, right? Oops.
The date picker. Yeah, the date picker box.
Like this?
Yeah.
It's similar. I mean, it's not as nice looking as this.
It's not as clean.
But you literally ship nothing, and I get date and time all in one thing. And
it's accessible.
You can add all of the like accent color and all those pieces that work out of the box. It will work. So that's the cool part, is you splash a little bit of CSS on, not throw an entire framework out there, and you're good to go.
Color is fairly new. Is it supported across?
Yeah, it's pretty new. I don't know if it's I know it landed in Chromium browsers. I don't know if it's landed in Firefox or Safari. Off the top of my head.
Color. I know. It looks like it's green.
Cool.
I thought it was.
Yeah. Wow.
I usually
that was pretty fast movement.
For stuff that we post out, I usually check this before I'm like, okay, go use this, and that was one of them. So
I did just drop in a blog post to the select menu CSS tricks one. So like if you end up showing that one, the very first one is the one that I think really kind of shows the flexibility of it.
Going through it.
Yeah.
Give me 1 second. There we go.
Yeah, so if you just scroll down to, so this is Patrick Brissett, one of the PMs over at Microsoft, right? Yeah, scroll up the emoji one.
Oop.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
this
just
goes
right,
there.
that animated GIF. So if you have experimental stuff turned on, like this is just the same, like this will render just a regular select menu as well. But this is just showing, hey, because of the fact that we have fully defined the anatomy, and so they're showing keyboard, selection working there, and it just still works as expected. It's like, hey, we laid it out, in like a more radial form. Like it's not this like, hey, here's just a name picker that people think of when they think of selects.
So they
It's kind of
style
showing that.
everything. Are those emojis styled with like grid or flexbox, or are those just like laid out on each select?
So like that's the beauty of it is when you set it back, so I didn't build this one. My guess is he probably did it via grid is how I would lay it out. But that's the beauty too, is like, because we will reset, like you can then do it however you want, because you're just working. It's very similar to if you went and built your own component library yourself.
Mm-hmm.
No longer you're dealing with these like hacky workarounds. It's like, just we'll give you the part, and at that point you can touch it like anything else. And like one of the changes that we made to the spec for option elements was you can now put arbitrary HTML within them, which before you couldn't. So like if you wanted to make like a picker that had like somebody's avatar with their name, and then like think a flexbox layout, like just in the option, like that wasn't possible. And it was just due to the fact that I want to do a different type of layout inside my option. And so go to Google, Outlook, doesn't matter. Go anywhere and start searching for somebody, GitHub. You'll see their avatar show up next to you, and you can't do that in an option element today. So it's like just even the most basic thing. So
Yeah, that's really
super
cool.
stoked to see that move forward.
Yeah, that's huge. So I'll go back to a question I asked, and you can answer it or throw it however you want. Internet Explorer or like Edge
Sure.
these days with Chromium underneath. Was the movement there and I don't know if you know this or not, but like, was it because everything was moving so fast they'd rather contribute back to the main source of what was going forward, or what did that conversation look like?
Yeah, I mean, without getting into too many details, it came down to like at the end of the day, as much as people, and I will avoid getting on a rant here, as much as people want to say, hey, there's standards and specs and everybody should follow this spec, having worked in Edge and having worked on a ton of interrupt bugs, it actually doesn't matter what the spec says. It's just reality. It's like, what did the dev happen to author it in? How big is the site? And what did they happen to test? And what did they take a dependency on? Because again, like it was not uncommon for Edge to be following the spec, but us have to go adjust the spec and Edge because too much of the web took a dependency on a bug in a different browser. And it wasn't just Chrome. It could have been Safari. It could have been Firefox. Likewise, inversely, we at times, people had taken a dependency on us. And it's like, so it's one of those things where it's kind of like, it's fine in theory, but then in practice, it was one of those things where we were basically given the amount of slippage that had been allowed. We were basically, for lack of a better time, kind of like Frankenstein monstering Edge into Chromium. That was what was happening. It was just like,
yeah,
it became less and less about like, hey, let's like go fight, the good fight for spec, because of the fact that it was like, well, we're going to approach them and we would be like, well, there's too many devs that are taking a dependency on this, so we can't break all these sites for spec purity. And so it was just kind of like, all right, we'll just update the WPT test. We'll tell them to update the spec to match what Chromium is doing, or whatever, pick your browser of choice that you think that we were breaking bugs with, because mobile at the time, of course, iOS plays a role in that as well.
Yep.
So I was actually thrilled when they made the call to move over, because all of a sudden you got to go, like, I mean, I had a litany of backlog items. Like I would toy around with container queries, and I would toy around with, I don't know, take your pick of, pain points that everybody feels should have always been solved. And a lot of Microsoft wasn't able, like the Edge team was not spending as much time as it could have been solving really complicated problems, because it was just constantly trying to like make it so the internet ran. So yes, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I always love hearing kind of the backstory on, like, it was headed one way, and I was so thankful when it like finally shifted, because I was like, man, we're gonna kill IE 11 finally. Like, why are we going divergent again?
Yeah, it seemed like a sigh of relief when you said that earlier, and I think it is for anyone that has to like support IE. We were all the way back to IE 8 at my job, and then they decided to drop that and keep IE 11 for a time. And how big of an impact did that have?
Yeah, well, so I mean, it's mixed because, like, I mean, there were two options, right? It was like, hey, basically match every other browser vendor with the same market share. So, like, have a roadmap to accomplish that. So, if we take iOS, for example, go match them on that so that, again, you have a better standing for winning your, hey, you know, devs are going to test for us, or you're going to match us from an investment of throughput with, say, a Google, for example. Or you're going to say, no, we're going to start contributing to one of these open source projects. And so it was kind of like, where do you want to, place your bets? Where do you want to do it? And so, yeah, it was super awesome to be able to move over there and be able to start like the focus group work that Travis Leathhead and others are working on, the just all of the things like the privacy work that the Microsoft Edge team has been working on. It's one of those things that it unburdened us from having to focus on interrupt problems and saying, we likewise talk to a ton of devs and know a ton of problems that like nobody is actually focusing on right now. And so we'll pick those up and go champion those. And that's kind of, again, where OpenUI actually enabled us to spend that time and actually do real product work and step forward and say, no, we're going to make a case for it. We're going to stand up a community. We're going to make it happen. And without that, we would probably still just be, I don't know, take your pick on features we would be implementing in hopes to stay afloat.
I think that's maybe a good time for you to talk about how do you get involved? How do we, like the users and people, how can we help?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And like one of the key things we put forward very early on. So Nicole Sullivan and I had met a long time ago about potentially setting up a community group for this. And we spoke about it. And one of the things we didn't want to have happen is we wanted everybody that's building components and controls every single day to actually be the ones providing the insights. Because like as much as the browser vendors want, we want people to get on and provide their insights. Like take the CSS working group, for example. Hey, we want your input on XYZ feature. But like actually implementing that needs a lot of spec knowledge and browser implementation knowledge. And so it's kind of a high entry barrier for people to engage. Whereas interestingly enough, it's the inverse when it comes to controls and components. Browser vendors rarely are spending time building them.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like the expertise is actually not at the browser layer. And so it's one of those things where it's like, we don't want to turn this into a working group because then you have to be a member to heavily participate, to be on the calls and stuff. And so the community group, we spun up a Discord trying to make it as accessible as possible for like how people would expect to engage. I provide the link elsewhere. So it's like, jump on there and like join us on Discord. I put the telecons in there every week. Ironically, I scheduled this with you all over the telecon. So luckily, Hid was able to jump on there and share for me. But basically, yeah, I'll put the telecons on there, and it's just a Zoom link, and we jump on. I'll provide like there will be GitHub issues, and so I think that's probably the best way is to just kind of like lurk for a week or two. But the other thing to do is that you're on this like getting started page is a lot of times is like, what are you wanting to accomplish? Like it may be, you know what, I really actually want, to your earlier point, example, I want a stylable and extensible date picker. It's like, okay, if that's the case, we actually do have a path for how to go bring, and because what you're proposing is, I actually want a new element, because you're not going to be able, for backup reasons, to just replace input type Datetimelocal. We're probably going to come out with, similar to how select menu is called select menu, not just select. We'll probably come out with like datetime, the element, right?
Yep.
At which point it's like, okay, you're going to do a ton of research. You're going to look at all the different potential date, libraries out there and stuff, and you're going to come back and say, here's what I think the default anatomy should be. Here's how I think the behavior should be. And there's a ton of time spent there because, again, going back to the accessibility scenarios, like, hey, are there things we're including, not including? I think if you go to the tabs, if you click the tabs right there off to the left, and then you go to, do a survey of analysis. No, the additional research. Yeah. So scroll down.
Sorry.
Like, oh, no, that was fine. Yeah. So it's one of those things where it's like they did a great job of just doing it in depth, because it's easy. A lot of people go, oh, just tabs, whatever. Okay, it's tabs. Just you can keep scrolling down. We don't have to actually read all this. So I just want to show like the amount of like effort that they put into like looking at all these different things, because there's a bunch of different ways in which you could do tabs. And
like
so
pros and
it's
cons on each one.
exactly. And so like there's things where they're like, hey, you know, technically in your if you go back and then go to the other one, so not this one, not the markup, but the other one, you'll kind of see what I did. Parts and part concepts, I think is the one I'm talking about.
This
You
is
scroll down.
the API of deciding on these things is one of the biggest conversations anytime we would build a component. It was like, so
Yeah,
how do
scroll
we
way down.
want to serve this? What's
Yeah,
better?
sorry.
Consumable, like putting them together, like, yeah.
Yeah, there's one in here that's like, I think even showing like games, for example. Like it was just one of those things where it was kind of like it was just they did a really good job of just showing, yeah, here you go, like this. Like we don't ever come across this on the internet most of the time, but this is still technically tabs, right? And so it's one of those things you're kind of like, yeah, I don't want to just say, here's the tabs that I come across 80% of the time today. Let's ensure that it's extensible to the point where it's able to achieve all of these. Sure, we'll come up with an opinion and a stance, but like we need to do the due diligence. And so there's actually they've called this spicy sections.
This looks like Winamp from like the 90s.
Yeah, this is super old school, but it's one of those things where it's kind of like, hey, like we do research not just on the web, we also go to native applications and stuff. And so if you're super interested in tabs, they actually have a affordance one. So yeah, here you go. This is tabs, for example. Like it's radial, it's in game, but it is still tabs. Like you have a segment and then it's going to show you additional content in the middle.
Yeah.
And so they just did a ton of great research and are like, they've now built out a web component that mirrors what they think it should look like. And there's a ton of discussion happening from the accessibility layer, because it's like, okay, like when you start thinking about it, how should the tabs look on mobile versus on desktop versus, you know, basically based on real estate. And so it's one of those things that it's like, hey, you know, in most mobile scenarios, we actually don't want them then showing up as tabs like this. We actually want them to more look like summary details. And so it's like there's a lot of great meaningful discussions happening, because it's like, okay, then the accessibility may have to pivot based on that as well. And this is again where it's like we'll have all that user research backed.
Yeah.
And you'll be able to just go, okay, cool. Yeah, you want to extend it, but man, it does so much out of the box in the amount of time that the spicy, they call themselves tab vengers. So if you go to Discord and you see the tab vengers channel, like you can join in, help these folks out. There's a core group of like 3 or 4 folks, maybe more, but yeah, they do an awesome, like, yeah, so you see Dave there from like, you know, Shop Talk. So if you anyways, so there a ton of awesome work is happening in this space, and like you could even just start there. Like this is what they did. They went and built a native web component and are like providing it as a native web component. Go use it, give us feedback. And it's like we can then use that as an implementation and say, let's go actually now just build that in the browser engine in ways that would be probably a little bit more performant. But so other than that, it's a great,
testing purposes, they're like serving them as web components, allowing people to use them. That's awesome. And then hopefully they will eventually become an HTML element to be used.
Yeah. Wow. It gives you a way of playing with it now. Yeah.
That's awesome. Really cool. That's just going through that list is like, that is so frightening to me. Like how long something like that will take, and like everyone has to agree on it, and like all of those standards. It's just like, it's mind-blowing when you think about the implications something like that will happen.
It's a government body like trying to pass things.
How long would you say,
yeah, go ahead.
How long would you say if like you start to like prove out like we're getting close, like from time of like inception research to actual implementation these days? Is that like a year? Is that 5 years? What does that look like?
It'll of course depend on the complexity of the component. Like to go back to one that I still have on my backlog that I haven't taken the time to do, but I feel is it's one that I think some people like brush aside. But if you imagined actually a checkbox component that allowed like you to do like checkbox grouping and stuff, we could probably do the research if you dedicated time to it, you know, like maybe like 10 to 15 hours of decent research to put together kind of like what you saw there. Like what are all the different scenarios? Here's the expected behaviors. The specking is probably, again, another 5 days. And this is, by the way, just the initial kind of proposal, probably another 5 to 6 hours. The implementation, again, of that is you're probably looking at maybe a week's worth of engineering time would be my guess, max, probably. That's me spitballing because I don't do much C++ contribution. So like that's me spitballing. But anyways, like, but the key is what you just were hitting on is like getting alignment by everybody, getting it out the door to everyone. And so it's like you're probably looking at the smallest one probably being 6 months to a year probably of actually being able to use it. Like, because you can get it behind a flag pretty quickly probably, you know, and like that's the case now. You can go with select menu, but like now let's talk about select menu actually being in Firefox and WebKit as well, to where it's like you can actually then take a dependency on it. That's a whole nother discussion versus like, hey, we're finally getting agreements on hard discussions and alignment on select menu in general. Like, when will it actually ship? If we see it ship in Chromium, let's say hypothetically in the next 6 months, I never want to speak for Apple because like we'll have to wait for them to provide that insights. But you're probably looking at probably at least another year post would be my guess at minimum.
Doing a good job over there trying to get them on track, right?
No, I know. It's nothing. It's nothing. I just don't want I don't want people to hear me say something and then exactly. I don't want. Yeah, I don't want to like make people think that I've had chats with them and know something because it's like.
She is. Jen Simmons is working on Safari now, and she's doing great at like getting some of the things that they were falling behind on, I guess, so to speak. So
yeah, Jen's wonderful.
I got a shameless plug before you switch again. So I threw together this like checkbox thing the other day. I think it's so fun. Like that to me.
Cool.
Like that's
a neat little transition.
And it's
but you got some JavaScript there. What's your JavaScript doing?
That's just putting like true false in. Just it's like checked. But it's still semantic. Like it has the whole thing and it's using it. So it's just me trying to fight, like use the standards. It'll be okay.
Yeah. No, that's a really nice looking one.
Just true false. You couldn't use the checked attribute. It looked like you did have the checked attribute there. You couldn't use pure CSS for that. I got to get Jay on that.
Maybe to display if it's checked or not.
Yeah. So what I was asking is, what needs the most work right now? What do you need the most help with?
Like I would just say I don't want to like put anything on the plate because like I think we've got a good movement going with select and pop-up right now. And so it would be more of like I would really encourage folks to join in and think about where they're passionate, because there is no, and we have areas that are good places to get started, like just helping review PRs, like is actually super valuable. Like you don't have to come in there planning to save the world, but it's like just getting your feet wet, like triaging issues, like, hey, this needs this label versus that label. Like any little bit can help. And as you kind of get, no, I do want to do a date picker, and I've now, been in here a little bit, like I've jumped on more than enough. Jump on Discord, DM me. I have no problem. Like I've set up meetings with one-offs with a few folks where it's like we go over kind of a game plan. So
I think it's really amazing what you've done with this open community and calling it OpenUI. I mean, allowing anyone to join, like you said, those telecon agendas, like you can just jump in the Discord, talk to people, like see the meeting without. So the fear of like open source contribution is that you don't know what's going on, but this allows you to get involved and kind of be a lurker in that community before you have to dip your feet all the way in.
And I'll share with you guys, but I have a recording, so I'm sure you'll have to add this after the fact, but we had a gentleman come and present on a concept that like hasn't really engaged in standards, didn't know like anything about it, how it worked or whatever, but was able to like, once we kind of like, here, let's codify how to go put together that story. He put it in a presentation and was presenting it to OpenUI, and like there was agreement that it was a problem we're solving and stuff of that nature. And it was one of those things that it's like, it's a great like on ramp. And that's always been one of the goals, is like kind of cut your teeth with OpenUI. And like, we're still doing very impactful work, but like you actually are still presenting to, different browser vendors and standards people that are in the CSS working group and stuff of that nature. And it's like, so who knows where you go from there, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. Awesome. Well, I think we hit all of our questions for the most part. The only thing I saw maybe Brittany removed was the Houdini connection.
I just knew that we were getting like towards the end, so I didn't know if we would have time for it. But yeah, I'd like to hear a minute about Houdini if you have like a rundown.
Yeah, so I think you were talking about the relationship between the two. And to me, like the biggest thing was CSS Houdini was a part of there was a mantra for a long time of explain the platform. So basically have no magic. And so Houdini, getting out of boxes, right, was actually explaining the CSS magic, so the platform. So it's like all the Houdini, like the layout APIs and all those, the paint APIs and stuff were about providing those primitives that the engine had that weren't yet explained. The relationship is actually the exact opposite, where I think that the standards body should be doing both. Like, yes, you should offer the toggles for developers to be able to touch the lower level primitives such as Houdini and stuff of that nature. But also a lot of devs just want very basic things. Like, I also do just want you to give me a select menu that is extensible, and maybe I just want to use it by default. I don't want to have to go build it by default. Because if people only wanted that, like technically we have the canvas element and we can go home, right? Like technically you can build every website to your own line layout and everything if you wanted to, right? So it's one of those things where it's like, it's actually the relationship would be Houdini should likewise be happening and efforts such as that should happen. But we should also not lose sight of what made HTML so great when it first started, which is it was approachable, it was easy to learn, it was easy to use, and it was resilient. So like the OpenUI components are trying to be that resiliency where it's like, yes, you can extend them, but they're accessible and performant by default. Like, so it's like, they're bringing you that ease built into the platform, and they're giving you that magic while still giving you the hooks that if you want to go beyond that magic, you can, which goes back to our web components talk at the beginning of like, I would have preferred custom elements to just be like, when you type a dash, you've created a native custom web component. If you want to change the properties, by all means, go in and define a custom element and change the properties. Maybe it's a closed shadow root and so on. And you can do that like some other way, but it's like, we should have both the program at Salesforce, we have a low code and a pro code paradigm of where you're doing drag and dropping, and then pro code is of course a coding. And it's like, part of me is like, a lot of the times I actually just want to live in the magic world. And every once in a while I want to go, actually get my hands dirty, but it's for very specific reasons. I don't want to do that for everything.
Yeah. Who doesn't want a little magic?
If you can move fast, but yet still get in, like that's the goal.
Exactly.
Right? That developer experience.
Awesome. Well, Greg, thanks so much. I know you're crazy busy, and we stole an hour of your day.
We do, yeah. And you did this instead of the telecon. I can't believe that.
Well, no, thank you to HID and OpenUI for making that happen, because we've bumped this 3 times now. So yeah, thank you all for the time and the opportunity. This is awesome.
Yeah, thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon.
We didn't do Purrfect Picks.
Oh, we didn't do Purrfect Picks. Oh my gosh, what am I saying? Wow. Should we throw those in real quick?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. That would be a first.
I'll follow your guys' lead.
I was also going to say we had another person who's in OpenUI, Unicravitz, on talking about making the web better, and I wanted to throw that in the chat if anyone wants to go watch that, because that was also a very good episode.
So
Una's amazing.
I was totally lying. We're going to do Purrfect Picks. Here we go.
Nice transition.
This is like the speed round, maybe. So Greg already kind of talked about Discord out there. We put the link out there. It's good to go. Greg has another fun pick for us, though.
Yeah, so this is Legal Eagle. I've been binging it lately, and I was watching a lawyer show recently, and basically all he does is takes videos and tells you how good or bad they did in law, and you can just determine whether or not they actually know what they're talking about or not. And I realized a lot of these movies, I actually don't want them doing it per the book, because it would be really boring.
Right.
So, but it's a really fun show.
That's awesome.
Great pick. Design system.
Yes, my first one is the newsletter that I get once a week, and it's got all these really nice curated design systems, like newsletters. So there's like, our blogs rather. So the newsletter sends you like 5 blog posts that were relevant in the design system world in that week. And I think they're always great. They're always well curated and well thought out. And I just liked it. Thought it was a good episode for that.
And then when you get tired and you need
when I need some water. So in this one right now, I have the blue raspberry one. I don't know if you can find it, but there's ones with caffeine in them, but they have like no calories. There's no sugar in them. I just put it in my water and make it taste better. And I have that berry blast one. I have so many of them.
Is it a predetermined amount? It goes, psh, and you're good?
Well, it squirts, so you can make it squirt longer, but I just do like squirt, 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 and I don't know. I do like 10 in a bottle, like
cool.
this size.
As long as you drink water, that's the key, right?
Yeah, exactly. It makes me drink more water.
Awesome. Fastify just released their 4.0 version. So if you ever use Express, just think of this as, in my opinion, maybe it's written down somewhere, but a faster, more DX friendly version of Express. And I think a lot of people assume like Node.js comes with Express or is Express or whatever. You can still use Node and use like Fastify or another library like this, and it's crazy performant.
Just reminded me of NPM and PNPM, and PNPM is performant node package manager. It's like throwing shade at the.
This is like P-Express. Ooh, that sounds weird. Anyways, this is kind of as simple as you can get Hello World, but that's what it looks like. I think it's super clean and easy to write and crazy fast apparently. So my second pick I am actually on today is my Mac Studio. I took the Adobe After Effects file that I could not run on my old computer, and it was just impossible. Opened it up, and immediately it started going and played. And I was like,
whoa.
So it's crazy fast. It does help. I bought the biggest, baddest one.
He told me how much RAM he had. I was like, what?
When I have 128 gigs of RAM and like 70 of it went to After Effects, I'm like, that's why you need it. The cool part too in how this works is it's unified too. I don't know if that's the right word, but the GPU and the CPU can use it, and it's amazing. So really cool, really excited and happy about it so far. We'll see how it goes.
Awesome.
All right. Awesome speed round of Purrfect Picks. Really appreciate it. Again, Greg, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. You all have a good one.
You too. Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Thanks. Later. We didn't warn him.